Hello and welcome to Radicals, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. So, this is going to be episode one of my podcast series covering radical politics, their impact throughout history, and, really just try to develop some sort of a takeaway and a view for how to coexist with radical politics, um, and, reap the benefit of them, but also not letting things get to the point where, we have people storming the Capitol because of their radical ideology. So today I am really just going to cover sort of the history of radical politics in democracy, and, well, not necessarily just democracy, but starting in more modern times, then we'll take a closer look and examine ancient Athenian democracy and the radical ideas that came from that. And we'll finish by looking at sort of the early American political system and the two parties that were initially developed. And essentially, how examine how those two parties were radical in and of themselves. So, to start off, we are going to look at the first time the word radical was used to describe a political movement or something like that, which was in England in the late 1700s. So, radical politics, it denotes the intent to transform or replace the fundamental principles of a society. And the process of becoming, to these ideals or holding these opinions is called radicalization. The Oxford English Dictionary traces usage of radical in a political context to 1783, when Charles James Fox proposed radical changes in the British Parliament system. He was a member of the Whig Party in 1797, and this was centered around a idea called the universal manhood suffrage, but we will get to that here in a second. This in turn denoted all of those people in support of changes in Parliament as radicals, and by the 19th century, radical politics were becoming more common as the party politics in England became more moderate and less, aristocratic and favoring wealth. So any, political system we can already start to see will foster some sort of radicalization out of oppression of one side or the other. There's going to be people, the more pressure one side puts, the more pressure the other side is going to have to put back, and it drives people to the edge. So, kind of the next time we see radical used, the term radical used politically, is in France in the late 1800s. And this is another time when universal manhood suffrage is a main idea. So, what is universal manhood suffrage? It notes the ability of any man to vote regardless of social standing, income, or any other factors. And it was sort of an initial swing at aristocratic culture. And it's interesting to see how, all of these civil rights movements throughout history are deemed to be led by radicals, and the changes they they want are so controversial, but now we look back on them and we're like, well, wow, I can't believe we did this earlier. Or we didn't do this earlier. And, it shed some interesting light on the part that radical politics play in society, and I don't know that we would make a ton of progress without them. In late 1869, a self-labeled radical faction of the French government, led by Georges Clemenceau, shifted away from the standard democratic republicanism, and by 1881, they were calling for broad social reform. By the turn of the century, this had evolved into the Radical Socialist Party, which is, almost the polar opposite of a democratic or republican, style government. The socialist will follow, a much more helping hand kind of policy. And, of course, we all know how socialism and how capitalism, those things play out. But, the opposite was formed because the main party was oppressive. Well, thus far, it's safe to say early radical political movements came from a progressive place after literally thousands of years of plebeian suffering while the ruling class lived in luxury. This isn't so far off from what radical left civil rights movements of today are, such as BLM and Antifa calling for reform in in the nation's law enforcement due to hundreds of years of racism and other prejudice. And you can also see, the sort of mirrored effect on the right wing. They don't think that what BLM and what Antifa are standing for is exactly justified, and both sides will continue to just kind of dig their heels in harder regarding the subject. So now we're going to take a step back and look at radical ideology in ancient Greece. So ancient Greece was sort of the birthplace of the first democracy, and that was in Athens, Greece. And I think it's useful to look at this because it's sort of the most relevant to our. It's like the oldest, most relevant to today's government for Americans. As with most things, Greece parsed out quite a few of the early problems with democracy and had some radicals of their own. Athenian democracy was developed in the 6th century BCE, though all forms of government had radicals. Those of Athens had the most in common with our radicals today. Democracy and the power of the people were viewed as extremely radical ideologies at their inception, so it's almost a miracle that something like democracy ever even came to be. In fact, the greatest opposition to democracy in Athens was that it gave too much power to the people. Individuals who were not politically involved were viewed as too incompetent and uneducated to have any say in their own governing. And, this may seem rather prejudiced now, but you have to remember everyone was used to monarchies, oligarchies, and, other oppressive forms of government, and Athens was the first experiment of a large-scale population-inclusive government. In this day and age, the problems with Athenian democracy are more in the restrictive qualifications for political involvement and are in opposition to ancient philosophers' opinions on the subject. So, we look at ancient philosophers' writings and such, and most of them were far on the side of, we can't let these uneducated people vote, we can't let this or that happen. But today, we look back at Athens, and this was a couple thousand years before the idea of universal manhood suffrage. And without that, and in that far back of a time, the restrictions for getting into any sort of political involvement were very high. So, the argument could be made that Athens was probably less of a, democratic state than it may be presented to be, but it certainly was a huge, huge step for its time. Democracy is a radical idea, and while not the origin of radicalism, it is the most relevant to our topic. It's easy to look back at Athens and see the progressivism we Americans reap the benefit of. We have legal universal suffrage, a much more functional version of democracy known as a republic, and although this podcast will examine many of the misgivings of American democracy, it is important to remember how good we have it in comparison to history and the rest of the world. So now we're going to go take, a look forward again, sort of at early radical politics in the United States. Radical movements in America and their impact on today's radicals is sort of just where we have to start looking at this. And to get off with that, we need to examine the first parties formed in the U.S. and how they produced their own extremists. The Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson, were the first two political parties created in the United States government. So both were formed. It started being formed during George Washington's first term, but they picked up steam and had their ups and downs at different times. So first we're going to cover the Federalist Party, and it was led again by Alexander Hamilton. It was technically the first political party in the United States, and it dominated national government from 1789 to 1801. but it did eventually fade out of all relevance and existence by about 1816. It called for a strong national government that favored economic growth and a friendly relationship with Great Britain. It was formed in 1789 as a coalition of bankers and businessmen in support of Hamilton's fiscal policies. So, Hamilton's fiscal policies included the desire for a national central bank, and this was, out of his own desire to assist state governments that had taken on massive debts throughout the Revolution, and to keep the national debt down. He also aimed to help American manufacturers become more self sufficient by importing fewer goods and exporting greater amounts of goods. He surmised paying high premiums for British goods limited the American economy and was sort of just an extension of their previous oppression under Great Britain. This political ideology was known as mercantilism. Thus, the Federalist Party appealed more to some conservatives who aimed to maximize the nation's wealth. But you can't look at it quite like conservatives and liberals nowadays, because this whole Federalist Party idea um, was completely irrelevant by the time the mid 1815s to 1820s, kind of rolled around. It was non existent, and the focus shifted to the Democratic Republican Party. But the Federalist Party, it fostered heavy nationalistic politics, and it was responsible for the Jay Treaty, which is stated to be the Treaty of Amity, Commerce, and Navigation between His Britannic Majesty and the United States of America. And this was a treaty signed in 1795 between the United States and Great Britain, and it did avert war, which was the War of 1812, for about 10 years, and it allowed for some peaceful trade between the two countries. But this was during the French Revolutionary Wars, and it very much angered France, as, France and Great Britain were never on great terms. And per usual during this time, they were not happy to see the Federalist Party side with Great Britain, especially when they were the controlling political party in the United States. So after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party lost much power and started to fade out. People weren't liking the politics as much. They saw that the Jay's Treaty didn't really change much, and the Democratic Republican Party was able to pick up some steam. But now we're going to kind of switch gears and go over a brief history of the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson. And this was the second of two political parties formed near the inception of the United States, and it was founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the early 1790s. This party was a proponent of republicanism, political equality, and expansionism. So, where the Federalist Party looked more to, I guess, it capitalize on the resources that we already had and build a very stable economy off of that, the Democratic Republican Party was more interested in expanding, across the U.S. and having, political equality for all, at this time, white people. But that will, come back into play here in just a few minutes. So this originated as a congressional faction that opposed the centralizing politics of Alexander Hamilton. Both parties became more solidified during Washington's second term as president, as during the first there was some semblance of agreement between people. But this, the disagreements becoming larger had much to do with the Jay's Treaty, which I previously mentioned. Another great divide between the two parties came through national debt and government spending. The Democratic Republican Party wanted to reduce government spending and national debt, while the Federalists wanted to offer more assistance to states in debt and cared less for the overall national debt. The Democratic Republican Party also disliked the deals between the U.S. and Great Britain and viewed the Federalist Party as almost aristocratic and sort of like a Great Britain 2.0. This disdain was grounded with the fear of turning into something similar to the British monarchy that they had just escaped a quarter of a century earlier. After the fall of the Federalist Party in 1815, a short-lived era of good feelings before the Democratic Republican Party split in two. So this era of good feelings was sort of another time when the party was able to, agree with each other and not have a ton of issues for a couple of years. But all good things and all agreements must come to an end. So the split came next, and the split was due to James Talmagage Jr. proposing amendments providing the eventual exclusion of slavery from Missouri. So, he proposed an idea that was like, hey, I don't like slavery much. What if we were able to do something about it? And he proposed these amendments that would eventually ban it from Missouri. Personally, I think Missouri was not the best state he could have started with, but this guy was incredibly brave. And he's sort of our first absolute radical that we see in this area, where Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were just, politicians in disagreement and formed political parties. James Talmage Jr. was considered extremely radical for proposing an idea such as freeing slaves. And I know it's crazy. They wanted freedom, so they ran away from England, and then they immediately started oppressing. I guess that's just the way humans are. But this idea, in turn, was supported by New England Democratic Republicans, many of whom had been Federalists prior to its fall, and on the other hand, it was starkly opposed by Southern Democratic Republicans. So all of this information sort of begs the question of, how do these parties stack up to today's political parties? You probably hear politics mentioned that could swing either liberal or conservative for, both sides, and the answer lies between vastly different worldviews and political climates 200 years ago. Some things were simply accepted that just aren't now. And the easiest place to start examining this comes from the division of the Democratic Republican Party. The wealthier, aristocratic, previous Federalists were not in the same position to own slaves as the Southern plantation owners. A few very low-wage servants would serve a house fine in the North, where most white-collar work was done while hundreds of laborers were needed to keep a plantation running in the South. So my personal theory is that it was simply less monetarily damaging to have paid help in the Northeast than it was in the South. This, I believe, was one reason the Northerners were more willing to support the radical idea of abolition than their Southern counterparts. As I previously mentioned, I believe the Northern states' move against slavery was driven by a lack of direct impact just as much as it was their own personal moral standings. Sure, their clothing costs would go up, and other plantation harvested goods would rise in price as well, but overall, Northerners just weren't going to feel the same damage that Southerners would. None of this goes to say that Southerners were justified in their beliefs, but rather to understand why they fought against abolition with such vigor for the better half of the century. Naturally, all these factors on both sides drove individuals to the fringe, forcing them to dig their heels in on their ideals. Radical anti-abolitionists saw only the money they could lose in the extra work they themselves would have to do without slaves, and radical abolitionists saw the grave injustice done to people of color and stood firmly in their belief that humans should be treated somewhat equally. Again, true equality is even today, still a ways off. But the important thing here is that neither side could have a productive conversation on the topic because each only saw what issues they cared about. A Southerner and a Northerner weren't going to sit down and talk about abolishing slavery because the plantation owner will just stand firmly against it because he is going to be in such a worse financial place when slavery becomes illegal, and the Northerner will exclude their personal bias and stand on the moral high ground that is abolitionism. So that sort of brings us to the end of this first episode. Um, I'll continue starting around, the Civil War and things like that next week, and we'll go right up through present day, and then after that, we'll start examining some of our more modern groups and things like that, and just go around and find some interesting things to talk about. But when I began researching for this episode, I didn't expect to find the amount of nuance and rationality to some political extremism. Is when it comes to a boiling point, all of that rationality is thrown to the wind. But I can now more clearly see how and why people come to hold their ideals so dearly and are willing to go to the ends of the earth to spark or stop change. So, buckle up for the sizable and entirely wild world of radicals, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope to see you all next week. Remember to like and subscribe. Have a good one.